Brent Kugelmass is a former technology entrepreneur who's dedicated his focus to climate and energy challenges. One of the early pioneers in commercializing drones, he founded, ran, and sold a business within complex technical, regulatory, and public opinion frameworks. He received his master's in robotics from Stanford in 2011, and his early work includes designing a lunar roller controller for NASA, a concept electric car for Panasonic, and automating solar manufacturing processes for NanoSolar. In 2017, he launched a DC-based research institute, the Energy Impact Center, focused on exploring the challenges and opportunities of nuclear power's role in deep decarbonization. Their work includes publishing audio interviews with hundreds of experts throughout the nuclear sector. So join me in welcoming Bret to the stage.
We live in a very interesting time. Never before has technology allowed us to do so much. Has there been so much access to wealth and capital and just the ability to move around the world, the ability to change the world. Things have never moved so quickly. And yet there's some interesting threats maybe around the corner as well. Bioengineered superviruses, cyber attacks that could cripple our infrastructure. I wish there was some overarching rule that we knew, that everything would be okay. But I guess we're just going to have to take it on chance and see where things go. I'm going to give a little bit of a lecture on entrepreneurship today, but I can't promise you that the rules are going to stay the same over the course of the next 10 or 20 years. But I can tell you my story and see what you guys get from that. Starting a company is tough. There are a lot of stresses. You know, sometimes even looking back, I'm here in front of an entrepreneurship class, and I'm not sure it's worth it. There's so many ways that you can make money and do good in this world. Take on the extra stress of a startup, boy, it's stuff you can't even imagine. I started my first company. It's a robotics company, right? Everything that I ever wanted to do since I was in high school. Like, how bad could it be? I started with my two best friends, lost my two best friends, had to fire employees that I didn't want to, tough time hiring, reporting to investors. The stress is pretty real. And this is why you see even, entrepreneurs who run enterprise, SaaS companies, software companies, you sell something to businesses. You see them saying, oh, I'm changing the world. Every startup is changing the world. That's the lie that we have to tell ourselves just to live with what we're going through. But, upon reflection of my experience, I realized it really wasn't how well I did financially, that was driving how I felt, but really what problem you're trying to solve. And so, throughout my 20s, I got a lot of great experience, built up this company, sold it. It seemed like a success. And then, when I was reflecting on it, I didn't even want to, it wasn't even worth the extra money. It wasn't even worth the earn-out to, go work for another company. I just wanted to figure out how to make myself happy. So there's your fail for you, right? You got this framework, this fail, risk, try. What is this? Fail, risk, try, do. But what I did realize, what makes you happy and what gets you through all the hard times and the stresses, is when you're working on a problem that's truly meaningful. What's the biggest problem we face today? Climate change. Thank you. And so when I kind of set out to think, what was I going to do next? I said, all I want to do is work on the biggest problem that I can. That's what I want to dedicate the rest of my life to. So I decided to take my learnings from Silicon Valley startup world, and boy, you can learn a lot out there fast. I mean, in Silicon Valley, they know the best marketing techniques, the best sales techniques, how to think about businesses, how to grow businesses, how to access capital, how to raise capital. It's like that whole area is just like boot camp for entrepreneurship. So I decided to take everything that I'd learned in that process, move to DC. Here's your risk, where I didn't know anyone, left all my friends, sold my motorcycle, only brought with me what I could fit in a suitcase. But I moved to DC to start a nonprofit. But I was going to run it like a startup. The problem we were going to try to solve was climate change. So, what was the first thing that I did? In terms of problem identification, met with the climate experts and said, I hear these things in the media about climate change, but I really just don't understand it. Should I just kind of take them at their word? 97% of scientists agree. And the first thing that I learned from them, it blew my mind. I don't know how many of you guys know this, but if we were to go net zero in emissions today, globally everywhere, in industry, electricity, transportation, agriculture, heat, everything, zero new emissions, right? That's the goal, zero new emissions. That wouldn't solve anything. That was the first thing I learned when I talked to the climate scientists, that our goal that we hear about, zero new emissions, it would leave us in exactly the same place that we are today, right? Because the carbon dioxide in the air, that doesn't correlate to temperature, right? That controls the rate of heat that we're adding to the system. So things are just going to keep getting worse year after year. And so then I asked around to these same climate scientists and I said, well, what could actually solve climate change? And I said, well, obviously, we need to remove all the carbon dioxide that we've been putting in the air for the last 200 years. And that's when the problem solving really began. Because if you run through every energy source, yes, many of them are great, like renewables, great for clean air, can replace dirtier sources of energy, but there's only one that could actually run the carbon clock backwards, that could produce so much extra energy in such a way that it could not only replace all fossil fuels, remove all extra CO2 that we've already put in the air, but also account for its own inherent carbon footprint while doing so. And that's because of the magical nature of nuclear energy, right? And it truly is magical. You split an atom and you release 3 million times as much energy as when you split fossil fuels. 3 million times. 3 million times as much bang for your buck. That is unbelievable. And in order to produce heat in such a way that we could capture all the CO2, it just needs to be 3 times as cheap. 3 million times the advantage and 3 times as cheap is where we need to get. But what about all these problems? Clearly nuclear has all these issues, waste, safety. Yeah, that could be weapons, right? So I started going around interviewing all these experts in nuclear energy, thinking, all right, Energy Impact Center, all we got to do is come up with a solution for each of these problems and bring it to the world, and then nuclear can be used to solve climate change. And what I found was these 3 problems, and a few others, that we assumed to be the issue weren't problems at all. The waste has never hurt a person, place, or thing in all of human history. Your standard nuclear reactor can't be used to make weapons. And at Fukushima, right? Fukushima, the nuclear accident, catastrophe, they call it. No one died. 3 gigawatt scale meltdowns, what we've all been so afraid of. Oh my God, if there was a meltdown, it would wipe out half of the US, we couldn't live there anymore. No, not a single person was hurt. So why did we feel this way? Why do we feel that these are issues? Well, so we went around interviewing all these experts in the nuclear community, and we found that they were actually trying to solve the same problems. Thousands of brilliant minds working to solve these very same problems that weren't issues at all. And in fact, what they were doing was they were convincing the world that these were issues with their actions. You see, when you spend billions and billions of dollars, you set up institutions around the world, you promise that you'll bury the waste for 1,000,000 years. Those actions are what actually convinces people that those are problems to begin with. And no matter how much they were saying, oh no, they're not really that big an issue, it didn't matter. They'd already set up the infrastructure to convince everyone that these were the problems. So now what to do? So we entered this space, we thought we would solve these problems. And we had to figure out what was next. We have to convince the entire nuclear world that they've been taking the exact wrong steps, that they've been trying to solve problems that aren't really problems, and in doing so, convincing everyone that they are. And we have to convince the rest of the world that nuclear isn't as bad as they once thought. Quite the opposite. And so that's what the organization Energy Impact Center does now. We've got a few different programs that we use to create impact in the world, that we use to facilitate innovation in a way not that tries to tackle issues that don't exist, but tries to actually combat the real problems that we face in order to bring this incredible, incredible technologies to abundance. And boy, do we need abundance. There's about 400 reactors operating around the world today. We would need about 40,000 gigawatt scale reactors built in just the next 20 years in order to pull all the carbon dioxide out of the air and actually reverse climate change. So, one of our programs is the Titans of Nuclear podcast. We go around, we interview experts around the world. We've interviewed over 1,500 people so far, 200 which have been turned into podcasts put online. And you can listen to these and get up to speed on all things nuclear. That's one of the programs that we put forward. Another program that we put forward is actually something that's going to be a very special announcement for you guys today. We're launching a prize just for University of Michigan students. This is going to be the first in a series of cash prizes where you get to tackle the challenges in the nuclear industry that we think are important. And that prize is to reimagine nuclear waste. That's right. We're going to have you guys dream up ways to productize nuclear waste. Change the perception so it's not this bad thing, not the NIMBY, not the not in my backyard, but the yes in my backyard. And the winning team of just University of Michigan students is going to win $17,000 for whoever comes up with the best business plan to do so. So I'm definitely looking forward to talking to you guys more about this later today as well. Before I continue, I just want to talk a little bit about why combating climate change is important, because I think in the rich world, we don't really think too much about it. And it probably won't even affect us that much. Yeah, there's going to be more adverse weather conditions, hurricanes, and wildfires. I mean, these kill hundreds of people. Yeah, it's pretty terrible. But what we're going to see happen to the rest of the world, drought alone. Guys, there are 2 billion people on this planet that do not have the capital, the infrastructure, or the know-how to adapt their food production systems to any abnormal changes to rainfall. That's what we have to be worried about. That's what we're working for here, guys. Stopping climate change means stopping drought. Drought which could affect 2 billion people. Make them lose their homes, make them lose their livelihoods. That's what we're worrying about here. Our opportunity in deploying nuclear energy and making it cheaper, it's not just climate change. Because the very thing that we're worried about with climate change, which is putting these impoverished communities into dire straits, The opposite of that, giving them abundant energy, is the very thing that can enable prosperity across the world. If we make nuclear energy cheap enough to produce heat 3 times cheaper than fossil fuels does, when you're starting off with that 3 million times energy advantage, if you can make nuclear that cheap, the whole world gets access to clean air. The whole world gets access to clean water. And the whole world gets access to abundant energy, which is prosperity. And here at Michigan, you guys are going to start with the first step to tackle this challenge. So thank you very much for listening to the introduction, and I look forward to hearing your questions as well.
All right, thanks, Bret. Okay, well, that's super exciting. It's not every day we get somebody out on stage who announces a $17,000 prize and is working on a problem that's going to affect 2 billion people. So congrats. That kind of puts you in a whole different category by yourself. But to kind of kick the conversation off, I just want to go back to your decision. You were out in the Bay Area. You were robotics. Did you have any background in nuclear at the time? And what was that process like to go from robotics, startup world to I'm going to found a nonprofit in DC and I'm going to focus on nuclear. Talk us through that journey a little bit.
So, a lot of my friends will ask me for advice on starting a company or even just, in starting anything really. And I think the most important, I can't offer advice on any given business. What I can offer advice on is a problem-solving framework, okay? And the problem-solving framework is you just always ask why. Why? Make sure you identify the right problem. It's very easy to think that you have to start solution first, right? To think you have the solution to a problem, invest a ton of time, effort, money, energy into it, only to find out that it was the wrong problem later. I mean, this is one of the biggest problems that startups run into. It's not that they don't execute well, it's that they execute well but solve the wrong thing. And so after I sold Airframe, I just kind of took a little bit of time to think, hey, what did I want to work on? As someone in the audience appropriately shouted out, climate change was the biggest problem that we face, and so that's just the only thing I wanted to spend my time on. From there, it's just a matter of asking why? What is the problem that we're actually trying to solve? And 2 years ago, I never met a single nuclear engineer in my life. Now I know about half the nuclear community, but it just comes from that same problem-solving framework. I mean, you guys can do, and if you have an analytical mindset and are motivated and willing to work hard, there is nothing that you can't do so long as you're actually trying to solve the problem that you want.
And as you're going through this, right, I mean, it's a huge problem you're trying to tackle. We all of us have kind of a limited amount of time that we can spend on anything in particular. So, now when you're in a startup world, obviously the pace is very quick and fast, but now in this world also, you got to move fast. Right? We don't have a lot of time to solve this problem. How is your perception of time and where you spend your time, how's that changed kind of over your career and how you think about that?
Let's talk about time in 2 different ways. One thing that I think I've gotten better at, and is a skill I'd like to continue to hone, is creating a little bit of more distance between stimulus and response. So that's time on the very micro scale. When someone asks you a question, actually think about it. Don't just say whatever comes to your mind. And then taking that a little bit further, beyond the micro scale to the day scale, when someone poses a problem, take the night to sleep on it. Don't feel like you have to come up with an answer immediately. And then time on the more macro scale. I mean, one thing that I did, which I thought was a little crazy at the time, when I moved to DC, I didn't get Wi-Fi. So I have no Wi-Fi in my apartment whatsoever. And what this means is that I can't watch Netflix for 3 hours every night. And it allows me to just kind of actually do better work when I'm at the office as well too, because that's my digital time. That's when I'm plugged in. That's when I'm working like mad. But then when I go home, I have a full 3 hours to decompress before I go to sleep and just cook and listen to music. I have some plants in the apartment. It's just a better atmosphere. And so I don't know if you guys are ever feeling, maybe because you're a little younger, I don't know, but I started feeling pretty overwhelmed with just all the pings and notifications and how much of it I saw different apps that were specifically designed to do so actually influencing my behavior. And I needed to create a little bit of distance from that. Mm-hmm. And so getting rid of Wi-Fi was the first step to that, and it's opened up a lot of time for me. So that's another kind of way to look at the time question as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because actually you're talking about energy of a different sort. You're talking about almost personal energy. And actually the ability to unplug actually helps you recharge your personal energy, so that when you go back the next day, in trying to provide some kind of balance between those things. Because certainly I've seen it in many, many jobs. Entrepreneurs are, by nature, we're pretty hard charging. But if you're not careful, you just spend all of your energy, and all of a sudden you just, at some point, burst into a ball of flame, and there's nothing left. I'm sure you've seen that. I've certainly experienced that. And so I guess that's one way that you would say, that's how you've started to manage it, right? You've started to manage it by unplugging, getting away from Wi-Fi, having dedicated time away. When did you start that in your career?
Right, so it's not so, everyone knows it's not easy to change habits. There might be a lot of things that you want to do that you just keep telling yourself, I'm going to eat a little bit healthier, I'm going to work out a little bit more.
Go exercise.
Yeah, it's tough. So for me, it actually took moving across the country, leaving all my friends behind, and just kind of being by myself in order to kind of reform some of these critical everyday habits. Now, obviously not everyone can do that, but I do encourage you, if you are ever making a move, to kind of take that opportunity to recalibrate a lot of the ways that you do different things throughout your life. So yeah, it took me moving to DC, moving into a new apartment, and literally just not buying the Verizon Fios package. Amazing. Yeah,
that's great. All right, we're at 1 o'clock, so at this point I'd like to transition to the student Q&A. All the students have kind of prepared questions, so first question. Oh, there's a gentleman up front here, Isabella. All right, and just like last week, please keep your hands up if you want to ask the next question so we can get the mic to you, and we'll go there. All right, please.
You mentioned that nuclear waste wasn't as big a problem as people are making it out to be, and you specifically mentioned Fukushima and so forth. I presume you're familiar with Hanford, Oak Ridge, Arvada, Golden, and places and so forth like that, where nuclear waste has been dumped and there is no permanent storage facility for nuclear waste currently. And do you not feel that those tens of thousands of people who are irradiated by that waste dumped is not as big of a problem as it is? And do you also think it's not a problem to not have a permanent storage facility for nuclear waste?
Yeah. We create many different types of wastes throughout life. The question is if they become a hazard to human health. Many of the, people like to say, oh, nuclear waste, but it lasts millions of years. What are we going to do for millions of years? Well, most waste that we create actually lasts infinity long. It's another way that nuclear is special. It'll take the thing that maybe you don't like, and it'll magically transform itself into a different atom. Whereas some toxic wastes literally will last until the end of the universe. And society has found ways to deal with them. When you refer specifically to certain sites like Hanford or other weapons production facilities, there's a lot of chemical waste there. I think it's very easy to get scared about radiation because we don't know it so well and because we've kind of been trained over these years to think it's so dangerous. But chemical waste is pretty nasty. And so I think there's a lot of confusion, which is chemical, which has chemical toxicity versus radiotoxicity. And then, Hanford is big business. It's good business for the cleanup crews. And so there's a lot of economic incentive to continue portraying it as a place that we keep need to clean up over and over and over again, even when you're beyond background radiation levels, because it's pumping $2 billion a year into their economy through the construction crews there. So there's a lot of nuances to this space and to this argument, and we're just going to have to dig into them together.
Yeah, I think that the key concept here is that, clearly throughout history, right, you've got, nuclear waste there's been issues, right? I mean, we all know there's been issues, and that we have to balance that versus other risks that we experience on a daily basis. Actually, our speaker last week was talking about autonomous vehicles, right? We have 30,000 people that die every year in car accidents, and somehow that's kind of societally accepted, and we're going forward and saying, hey, maybe that's not acceptable anymore. And I think some of the new nuclear technologies have said, hey, we've had issues in the past, and we're trying to address them, and we're aware of the past. And but to your point, there's other risks, right? There's chemical toxic waste and other things that we all have to balance.
And there's one other point that I want to make, and why I think that this prize and the way that we're framing it and your guys' efforts is going to be so impactful. It is very difficult to convince someone who has like an emotional attachment to a certain idea that they're wrong with a logical argument, right? You have to present them an emotional argument. And it's very easy to tell them, hey, what, waste is just actually not that bad. And here's all the facts to prove it. That actually really doesn't convince anyone.
Yeah, it's not compelling at all.
Do you know what does convince people? Making it something that they love, right? You can't make a negative worse by just making it less negative. You have to actually make it a positive. And then over time, you can create, use the same substance that people thought was bad and make it something that's good. And in doing so, actually truly change the narrative.
That's fascinating. All right, next question. Allie, up there?
So I watched this documentary, actually, I don't know if you've seen it on Netflix a couple days ago, about, it was about Bill Gates, and he's done a lot of work with nuclear energy after he left Microsoft. And so when I finished watching this documentary, I thought about it, I was like, isn't nuclear waste a lot like the car and the airplane psychological piece? Like, everybody's scared to fly in a plane because they're worried they're going to crash. But statistically speaking, you're way less likely to die in a plane crash than you are in a car crash. And when you compare that to like the amount of deaths per year from coal-fired plants, is that a route that the nuclear industry is looking at, kind of using that analogy to help prove that nuclear is safer than coal, for example?
I hate to characterize Bill Gates in this way because he has done so much good for the world. But I think he's learned many of the wrong lessons from the nuclear industry. I saw that documentary too, and a lot of things that they say, I couldn't disagree with more. And this is after having done these 1,500 plus interviews with the nuclear world. I think when they say that they've got a safer technology that they're bringing to market, one that removes waste, what they're doing is they're throwing the old technology under the bus, and in doing so, they're casting a negative light on the entire nuclear space, including their own technology. So yeah, his company TerraPower, they might think that they're, here's a solution that we're bringing to the world, but if the problem isn't a technical one that they're trying to fix, it's a public perception one, they're taking all the wrong steps towards addressing a public perception issue.
Interesting. I think that's really fascinating because that's kind of, entrepreneurs as a general rule are often like, yeah, the stuff last year, that's total crap, right? We've got the new solution. It's a very common kind of approach. But it's really interesting how in your space it's very, very different because basically it kind of reinforces old stereotypes. That then the same policy issues, the same regulatory issues actually don't go away because it's reinforcing some of those existing stereotypes.
Yeah, no matter how much their reactor or so could reduce this radiation, you can always crank down the regulations on radiation a little bit further and have the exact same issue with public perception.
Right.
So this always comes back to the same thing. And you guys might, hopefully some of you guys after this start, nuclear waste productization companies, but I'm sure you'll start all sorts of companies. And the one thing that I encourage you to always be challenging yourself on is, am I solving the correct problem?
Yeah, I before we jump to the next question, I just want to double down on that. In fact, a lot of what we see in entrepreneurs, I've helped faculty members for almost a decade now, it is exactly that. People want to jump to solutions, but we always end up backing them up to, well, what problem are you solving? And 9 times out of 10, they actually have to pivot what problem they're solving because they don't really understand their stakeholders or some reason. So that's, I mean, for all the students in the room, if I had any advice to you, like if you're going to start something, spend 90% of your time working on what problem you're solving before move to execution, because it's that search phase is so important. And executing actually is very comfortable. We like it. There's forward motion. You get to cross stuff off your list. It's awesome. But then you end up hitting a brick wall later because you didn't spend the time up front. So I think that's a super important lesson. JC, you got somebody? Great.
Hey, Bret. Thank you so much for this. Like, super insightful. So you talked about how the problem the robotics world you were in Silicon Valley because, left you a little unhappy. So I'm going to, question you on that a little bit. Do you think it was possible for you to have done all that you did with nuclear energy without having that maybe unhappy experience, but where you learned, maybe you worked on a less significant problem, but you learned how to execute, you learned all the lessons that you did, and you had a massive exit. You gained the capital, the safety to be able to work at a nonprofit. Is it possible for someone to be able to work on a nonprofit like this without having that experience first? And how difficult is it?
I think about that question all the time. Yeah, it was painful, but pain is learning, and hardship is learning. And yeah, everyone should experience hardship, because not just from the appreciation factor, but from the learning factor as well. So yeah, you're probably right. I had to suffer a little bit to get to where I am today.
I think that's also a really interesting lesson in terms of, personal challenges and just, those are just opportunities to learn and grow. I mean, certainly in my own experience, like those moments where I was probably the most depressed or most challenged were also the opportunities or the times in my life when I grew the most. Do you have any advice for the audience on how to kind of get through those periods? Or, because I'm sure many of the students feel very challenged at different times during their stay here at Michigan, and how would you, help them through those periods?
Yeah, I think that's why picking the problem that you're solving is so important. Because yeah, like I started off by saying, with the drone company, at some point, in our attempt to find product market fit, we ended up servicing insurance companies, and we were doing environmental permits for a while, but those environmental permits were just making it cheaper for the oil companies to pump more oil. So if you're not, I think what keeps you going through the hard times is just knowing that what you're working on is the right problem to solve. For some people, that might be working for others. I know a lot of people get a lot of personal satisfaction when they're doing something for other people. That's true for me too. But there's all sorts of other types of problems that can be the right problem for you, intellectual curiosities or pursuits. But just make sure it's the right one.
Yeah, so if you're really committed to the greater cause of what you're doing, it'll help kind of pull you through.
Yeah,
right.
And look, what we're doing right now is not easy either. I have to, like I said, try to convince the entire world they're wrong. I have to convince the nuclear industry that they're wrong about everything they've been doing for the last 50 years, and then convince everyone else that they've been wrong about the nuclear industry. That is not easy, but I have never had more fun, and I've never been happier than doing what I'm doing now.
Oh, that's great. Okay. Allie, do you have another one?
Hi, so my question is, you want to invest all this time and energy into popularizing the nuclear industry. So why not solar power or wind power that don't release these toxins into our environment? And also when you say that you're contributing to the business of the cleanup process, while I do see that as a viable option, how do you ensure that the people who are participating in this industry and participating in the cleanup process are safe and they're not harmed by these toxins?
Yeah. It's a real tough one when talking about renewables, because listen, clean air is great. Having a solar panel on your roof, or having a whole community full of solar panels and wind turbines instead of having a chimney stack close by, that's great. But they do also release a lot of toxins in other parts of the world where they originally mined the metals and materials to create them. Everything has goods and bads, right? But let's come back to that energy density with nuclear for a second. Via the very physical properties of nuclear, you're using thousands of times less material to produce the same amount of energy. You're using millions of times less fuel to create the same amount of energy, right? So it's a million times less stuff comes out off the back end when you're comparing it to other thermal power sources. So, the reason that we're so focused on nuclear is because although everything does have good and bad, nuclear has orders of magnitude less bad for the same output. And then there's the other fact about running the carbon clock backwards. In order to actually account for all the carbon that was emitted in the production of your materials, right? Because if you're going to make steel, carbon goes in the air. If you're going to make, purify silicon for solar panels, carbon goes into the air. Everything has a carbon footprint. In order for you to both account for that carbon footprint that you're making in the energy source, to power the process of pulling all the carbon out of the air, the bar to meet is you just have to have such an extremely low carbon footprint. It's not enough to just be lower than the next worst thing. Because otherwise, coal would be great, because coal is less bad from a carbon perspective than burning trees. Natural gas would be great. Natural gas is less carbon intensive than burning coal. But the only one that actually crosses that threshold of being able to account for its own carbon footprint is nuclear energy.
Well, that's fascinating, because I think, one of the things that I've become more in tune over the years is this idea of life cycle analysis.
Yes.
And how complicated that process is if you really start to account for, the semiconductor fab, right? It's actually making the solar panels, and how much how much energy does it take to actually create the solar panel in the beginning? Not to mention semiconductor manufacturing is not exactly the cleanest process in the world. But to do that life cycle analysis is actually pretty complicated, and it's a pretty complicated story to tell.
Super complicated. There is a good proxy for life cycle analysis, though. And now we're getting a little bit in the weeds with carbon here, but bear with me for a second. A good proxy is your entire system's mass. Because at the end of the day, every material comes from other materials, and there's materials to make that until you get to the raw constituent elements. And where you get that carbon footprint is in the processing and transporting of those materials. And those are both directly correlated to mass. So if you're looking to do a quick rule of thumb, LCA, life cycle analysis, just look at your entire system's mass.
Well, I guess that was pulling some back things like ethanol was a huge issue, right? Because you actually had to truck the corn, and you ended up using more carbon trucking the corn around than you were actually saving by producing the ethanol, I think is what I was told how it came out.
Yeah. Ethanol's a disaster.
Yeah, okay. Great. All right, another question, please. Oh, Isabella, way up in the back.
Oh, so this is just a clarification question. You mentioned that it would be about 40,000 nuclear plants across the world to totally turn back the clock. Would that include going fossil fuel free? And do you believe that 20 years is a quick enough time scale to fix the current problems we have?
Yeah. Well, first, we better do it in 20 years. Right? I am so sick and tired of hearing our leaders talk about fixing things by the end of the century. How uninspirational is that? There's nothing that we can't do in 20 years. You can look at Shanghai. They built an entire city that holds 12 million people in 20 years. So there's no reason that we can't put in place the infrastructure to build 40,000 nuclear plants in that period of time. If we're talking about casualties from climate change, we're already in the millions. If you see what's happened in Syria and Central America, these are from climate change. I think no matter what we do, the adverse effects from climate change are going to impact hundreds of millions. Our goal right now is to prevent that from being billions.
Yeah, so it's here now. We're seeing it now, so the sooner the better. All right, Allie.
How do you deal with the capital that's already entrenched in non-renewable energies like fossil fuels? Because obviously that's a big barrier to what you're trying to do. So how do you solve that problem?
Yeah, this is very controversial, but I believe that we have to make the fossil industry our allies. I think we need to recruit them and make them the heroes of saving the world from climate change. They've got the access to capital, they've got the infrastructure, they've got the engineering know-how to just do incredible things. Let's just convince them to put it to good.
So, I mean, I think that's interesting. You got to get to see the Chevrons and the Exxons of the world kind of see themselves as energy companies versus fossil fuel companies. Is that largely a policy problem or in a public perception problem that we need to solve? Actually, the two are probably related. To really put the foot on them to say, hey, you guys got to change and here's a pathway?
Energy is responsible for all prosperity. If we didn't have this alternate path and you were to ask me, what should we do, restrict energy or prevent climate change? I'd rather have climate change and have abundant energy for the entire world than the other way around. And so I think what the fossil industries and what the energy industry has done has been a net good for humanity. But net, right? So there's also a lot of bad too. And our opportunity here is to remove the bad and keep the good. So, why haven't they done it yet? I think, there's a lot of reasons that they just don't see an alternate path, and what they see them doing right now is very virtuous. They're giving energy to people across the world. They're allowing for food and medicine and building. I mean, everything is energy. Mm-hmm. And so I think, at the end of the day, they see themselves as doing good, and they are doing good. And they don't see another path to mitigate the negative consequences. But I think we just have to show them that path. I don't think we have to, force their hand or cast them as villains, or regulatorily constrain them.
So it's really, you're just hoping to lead them into it. Right.
That's right.
Got it. Great. All right. I think we have one last question.
Hi. You mentioned that we need to make nuclear energy 3 times cheaper for it to have 3 million times more effective than fossil fuels. Could you give us an overview of what are the next steps and what are the challenges in driving the cost down? Thank you.
Yeah. We have to go after cost and cost alone. I think a lot of nuclear entrepreneurship in the last few decades has been all around trying to assuage public concern by making the plants safer, even though they don't really achieve that goal, and it's not really the right goal to achieve. What they need to do is start focusing on making the plants cheaper. If you just apply, rigorous, unbiased, analytical processes towards looking at every cost driver within a nuclear power plant, there's so much room to gain, it's unbelievable. Remember, you've got that, your fuel is essentially free, right? You can go a long way with that.
All right, and with that, we'll close today. Thank you very much, Bret.